In this topic, we're going to look at these two major questions. First, what is the anthropological perspective? And second, what is culture? So we're going to look at the various components that make up the anthropological perspective, and I'll provide a little bit of context for why it's important. And then we're going to spend the majority of this lecture topic looking at what culture is. And just a little bit of a content warning that one of the examples I'm going to give that will bring together this definition or this anthropological understanding of culture with the anthropological perspective is that of genital cutting. And I'll give in the link to this video the timestamp for when this discussion is. So if it's a sensitive topic, you can jump ahead. Okay. It's an understatement to say that we're a very curious species, and some of the most fundamental questions that have driven humankind for as long as we have written records for and even oral records for relate to explaining some of the biggest questions that we have around the human experience, right? Including one of the questions that is kind of central to our course is, what does it mean to be human? Indeed, this question itself often begins with defining the very concept of human itself. So aside from this question of what does it mean to be human, well, what is a human? And so we're going to look at this quite a bit more at length. The question of why are we here is something that, of course, many religions of the world's religions have attempted to address. But I think that anthropology can provide some insights into where these various explanations come from, and can certainly help explain where we are today and why humanity is the way it is and why humans look the way they do and why we behave they do. What is our purpose is definitely a more challenging question. But again, I believe that anthropology has served to answer this as well. And of course, how do we understand the world around us? Well, anthropology is one of the means by which we can address this question. So, as I mentioned, all societies have asked these same sorts of questions relating to the human condition, and have come up with a diverse range of answers. Now, this course isn't about looking at the various approaches, but instead is looking at anthropology and the anthropological approach and the anthropological perspective and how we've attempted to understand, again, this big question of what does it mean to be human? Indeed, it's the anthropological perspective that sets apart anthropology from other humanities and social sciences discipline. It's what unites the four subfields of anthropology, as I introduced briefly in the previous video, and we'll get a chance to look at more throughout this term. So, well, what is it, and why is it so central to this particular course? So the anthropological perspective can be argued to be comprised of four major concepts, and I'm going to look at each of these in turn. First, if we look at cultural relativism, the most important takeaway of this is that it is an approach under which we attempt to understand culture from their own perspective. So we view other societies' customs, their ideas, their concepts, their structures, their institutions within the context of that society's own problems and opportunities, right? Many of the customs and ideas we have are a response to some of the problems or opportunities that we have had as a society. So cultural relativism means that we attempt to understand these ideas sympathetically enough in order to understand, again, what were the problems and opportunities that motivated these different ideas, that shaped these ideas. We approach the study of other cultures using cultural relativism and anthropology in order to avoid this ethnocentrism, because ethnocentrism is where we are judging other societies' customs, ideas, beliefs, practices, institutions, etc., based on our own values, right? Our own societies, again, ideas and customs and values and institutions, etc. And ethnocentrism, as you can see, is a very negative form of bias, right? Again, it's a judgment-based interpretation or approach versus cultural relativism, which really comes from kind of an open-minded approach to understanding, whereas ethnocentrism is a distancing mechanism. It's also kind of reductionist because it tends to then pick out the things that we don't agree with about another culture and kind of target in on that and narrow down our understanding of that culture based on this reductionist idea, right? So for an example of reductionism that I often use would be being, like Canada is all about Tim Hortons and hockey. Yes, hockey is an important sport in Canada. Yes, Tim Hortons is an institution that we have here in Canada, but does it reflect the complexity, the diversity, the range of experience, again, of values, of customs that represent what we might think of as Canadian or as Canada? No, it certainly doesn't, right? It's a very limiting, narrow perspective of what us Canadians, who we think we are, right? So in your book, your textbook, they do a good discussion around this, right? Is it really possible to avoid ethnocentrism? Don't we always take our own values and ideas into those other cultures that we study? And it's not even other cultures we study. Sometimes we're even studying our own cultures. So this is going to be one of the pieces of discussion that we will be undertaking in our live sessions in class the next time we meet. Cultural relativism is actually a really powerful tool for anthropologists, not only to avoid the ethnocentric bias, but also to understand cultural practices that might be challenging for us, again, mostly as outsiders, to understand. And genital cutting is a classic example of one of those issues that anthropologists have studied and have actually advocated for and argued quite successfully why cultural relativism is such a useful approach, right? And I don't say it's a method, it's just kind of a way of thinking, right? It's an approach, right? It's a way that we seek to understand these other cultural practices. So in your textbook, it outlines a little bit around some of the variations of genital cutting and various forms that it takes. And for me, it's at this stage not as critical to understand the various forms genital cutting takes, but rather cultural relativism challenges us to understand, well, why does this practice even occur, right? And so what we see through a cross-cultural perspective, which we'll talk about as another part of the anthropological perspective, is that for many cultural groups, or for some cultural groups, genital cutting is a valued ritual. We'll talk about rituals later on in the term. For other people, for other cultures and other groups, this is actually a violation, this practice of individual bodily autonomy and of fundamental human rights. And so we have this kind of tension point that then exists, and we see this in a larger global discourse that is occurring around genital cutting, around whether or not, is this a practice that should be banned, should be outlawed, if it's something that has a number of problems associated with it, and we can discuss this more in class as well. Why do people continue to practice it? And also it highlights this other question we have sometimes is, does culture force people to do things, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit throughout this term around agency and individual action versus how culture shapes our understanding of the world itself. Okay, but back to the anthropological perspective. So more on that to come in class. So participant observation is another key part of the anthropological perspective. And simply as I define it here, it's fieldwork. It's how we do anthropology. In week 3, we're going to get into this more at length, so I don't want to spend too much time at it. But participant observation is the means by which we gain insight into other cultures. We call it participant observation because we gain this information, we gain these insights, we learn about these other cultures by participating in the culture itself and observing these practices as they are ongoing, as they are occurring. So because, however, we're approaching this as and attempting to understand this culture as anthropologists, what this means is that ultimately we are outsiders, right? So it also recognizes that there's a distance that often exists between those of us doing this work and those people we are studying. Now, one of the things that separates out anthropology from other social sciences, the natural sciences, from other disciplines, is how we approach the people we study. And again, we'll talk more about this in week 3, but I just want to stress that we don't approach the people we work with, that we study, as research subjects, right? Instead, we treat them as informants, consultants, participants, collaborators, colleagues, friends, family, and in many cases, even co-researchers on this. So we'll talk a bit more about why we do this. But again, I just want to emphasize at this point that this is a really critical way that we, as anthropologists, distinguish our approach and our perspective from that of other disciplines that also study humans and human behavior. Another key thing that is distinctive to anthropology is that we take a holistic approach. And again, holism is going to come up a lot in this term. And actually, all of these components in the anthropological perspective is going to come out a lot this term. So I just am offering you a brief introduction into this now. So holism can be defined in many ways. I've heard it described as I list here, the whole is the sum of the part. But the way I like to think of it is that objects and people and environments all interpenetrate and define each other, that we have this complex relationship that exists between human beings, human societies, and our physical natural environment, including the plants and animals that we share our world with, right? And so what this means then is when anthropologists look at human societies, even if we're specializing in only one aspect of the human society, we recognize that it is only one of the small parts of that society, and that it is shaped and influenced by all of the other structures and processes that exist within that society as well. And again, we'll get lots of opportunities to engage with this a bit more as the term goes through on. Finally, the last part of the anthropological perspective is cross-cultural comparison, also known as ethnology. And so again, this is kind of what makes anthropology unique from disciplines like sociology, for example, is that it's not just about turning an inwards lens on our own society and understanding the own practices, but rather seeking to understand other cultures through cross-cultural comparison. So we consider a wide range of similarities and differences before we're going to make any generalizations about human nature, human society, or human history as a whole. And again, we'll see this reinforced throughout the term in many of the examples we're going to use. So when we use ethnology, it really is then the comparison of societies, right? It's a way that we can understand why one society does what they do, because we are looking at how other societies potentially have come up with, say, a solution. So for example, subsistence, right? How do we get what we need in order to survive, in order to eat? There's many different ways that we can do this. We can produce our own food, we can procure our own food. And again, we'll talk about this later in the term as well. But the key thing here is that what we're trying to get at very specifically is variations in different kinds of activities in order to understand why particular activities, beliefs, values, etc., are specific to that particular cultural group, or if they're shared, where do those points of shared understanding come from, right? So ethnology really is our basis for developing generalizations about the human experience. Now, I want to compare that with ethnography, and we'll talk about ethnography more in week 3, because ethnography is one of the outputs of anthropological fieldwork, and it is the study of individual societies. So we begin with an individual society or group, however we want to define. We do our data collection through participant observation. Therefore, we're able to gather empirical data on those human societies and cultures and then produce a publication or publications about that particular society, about that particular group, that reflects our knowledge that we've obtained about them. So again, ethnology then is cross-cultural comparison. Ethnography is individual study. So this is a really important distinction you need to make. But what is it then that anthropologists do? Again, in week 3, we're going to talk about this more, but I would also actually like to harken back to this quote by Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he says, in school, rarely do we learn how data becomes facts, how facts become knowledge, and how knowledge becomes wisdom. And so in anthropology, what we're looking at is this process of the creation of facts, of how facts contribute to the production of shared cultural knowledge, and then how shared cultural knowledge becomes what we might call wisdom, or again, practice within that culture as a whole. Okay, the next major concept we need to deal then with is culture. So how do we define culture? So I have a couple of examples of different kinds of definitions that anthropologists have used, and I just wanted to use them to highlight some of the shifts that have occurred over time. So an early anthropologist, Edward Burnett Tylor, in 1871 defined culture as that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, law, morals, etc., etc., etc. right? And the key thing is that it's this kind of trait list, this idea that culture has to have these certain kinds of things associated with it, and that's how we define it as an entity. Important here in Tyler's definition is also this idea that culture is something that is acquired, is something that we learn and obtain both actively and passively from our societies that we are members of. One of the fathers of American anthropology and the four-field anthropology that many of us practice today is Franz Boas. And in 1930, he expanded this definition beyond just a trait list to talk about all of the different kinds of social habits we have, but also then start to think about the people themselves, how people, individuals are reacting, right, to social habits, to social change, right, to they're adapting and changing their habits. And they're also living their lives in certain ways because they have been so shaped by their cultural groups. And he also talks about the products of human activities as determined by those habits. And so that's that nod of kind of seeing how archaeology, the study of the material components of human society, get drawn into this as well. Then we see a shift in the 60s. Louis Binford, a very famous archaeologist, defined culture simply as that which enables man or humans to adapt, right? So he sees culture as an adaptive mechanism, and this was inspired by a lot of ecological work that was being done at this time. By the 80s, we start to see this transformation away from kind of this almost what we might argue biological determinism, that humans are motivated by our ability to adapt to changes in our environment. People like Spradley, who studied marginalized groups, said that culture really is about knowledge. It's about the knowledge that we acquire as members of a group, and that this knowledge then generates the behaviors that we undertake within that group. And so that really it's this combination of knowledge and behavior within a social context that produces what we call culture. In your textbook, it talks about Richard Potts's understanding of culture as a structure, something that's built upon over the course of evolution. And in the notes below, I provide definitions for you of these different terms. And so he says that culture has these components. It's built upon these structural components that are the result of our evolutionary process. So we'll return to some of these ideas when we look at human evolution later on in the term. And many of these ideas, such as memory, for example, are not unique to human. And he says that's what's kind of the key, that it's not individual traits, but rather the package of traits that we have as humans that has allowed us to produce culture. So he says, things like transmission, memory, reiteration, innovation, and selection are all behaviors and are all parts of our cognition or how our brain works and how we approach the world that we do share with other animals. But what separates out human culture and what it's built upon are these three things: symbolic coding, complex symbolic representation, and institutional development. So he says this is what separates out human culture from animal behaviors, right? So for example, you might have seen images of a chimpanzee using a stick and sticking into a termite mound in order to fish out termites. Or you might have seen otters laying on their backs and using rocks to crack open shells on their chest, right? Tool use. So we might say, oh, they're using tools. Tool use is a form of culture. But what Potts argues is that, no, it's not as simple as just what we do, but it's about the cognitive processes. It's about the symbolic behavior that's represented by that. So later on in the term, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at worldview and symbolism in order to better understand some of Potts's arguments around what culture is. So what is culture then? How can we define it? And so the approach that I like to take is simply by not saying, well, culture has these various traits, but rather understanding how we define culture as a concept. And one of the most important things that we're going to look at this term is how culture is something that is learned, right? And we learn through two different processes. First, we learn culture. We learn our culture through enculturation, right? We learn to come to terms with the various ways of thinking and feeling that are considered appropriate within our culture. Right. And so this begins, both enculturation and socialization are both actively learned and passively learned. But enculturation is about how we think about the world around us, right? And we'll see some examples of how enculturation shapes, for example, family composition and marriage practices and the construction of gender and economic systems and stuff like that. But we also learn about culture through socialization, right? Socialization is how we learn about our behavioral rules that dictate our societies, right? What is the appropriate distancing between individuals in a line? What is the appropriate ways of behaving in a classroom setting versus in a more social setting, we might say, or an example of this would be, how do you approach your professor in a classroom environment versus at the superstore, right? Or at a grocery store when you encounter them, right? So culture is something that is learned. And again, we're going to look at this more throughout the term. Oh, sorry. Culture is also something that we share, right? And this is really critical, that it involves a group of people, right? It's not something we typically don't approach a culture of one, right? But it's the shared understanding. Again, it's these shared behaviors, these shared values, it's these shared ways of thinking. Culture is transmitted, so it's not just learned, but it's something that we broadcast out to the world at large, right? And we're going to talk about how when cultures come into contact with each other and how cultures influence and shape each other. Culture is adaptive. It is, and this is really important, right? That culture, because humans are also adapting to external and internal stimuli, right? Culture itself is adaptive. It changes over time. And actually, that's one of the key points I like to make, is that it is always changing. Culture is pattern. This means that there are rules. We see that there are, again, these patterns that we kind of see in terms of how cultures are constructed and shaped. An example of this is tacit culture or tacit culture. And so I have a couple of examples of that here on the slide. And when we talk about tacit culture, we talk about things that are explicitly or directly observable. And these are things that are often not formally taught, but we, again, learn through the process of enculturation and socialization. And this might include when it is and is not appropriate to speak, for example, right? What tone of voice we can use. Again, how to stand in line, where to stand in line, all of these different ideas, right? Even the language we use. I love this comic from KCD. It's quite an older one. It's about the terminology that we use. My daughter gets embarrassed when I try to use kind of slang words that her generation uses. I remember saying something about something being cringe, and she was just embarrassed because she's like, "Oh, that's not what cringe means, mama," right? And another important thing relates to culture shock. Often we don't even really recognize our own aspects of tacit culture until we come into contact with another cultural group. And an example of this would be, again, would be things like standing in lines. Like, what are the rules for standing in lines? So in Tanzania, for example, where I've done a lot of my research, yes, people stand in lines and queue in lines and stuff like that. But when I've been in certain offices like immigration and stuff like that, you'll just see a whole bunch of people up at the window, and people are kind of jockeying in to get the attention of the clerk behind the window who's assisting everyone. Other aspects, it's a bit more formal in terms of lineups and rules. I remember traveling in Japan, and people line up in these specific lanes on the sidewalk for taxis. Like, people queue up to get a taxi, so there's no dispute as to who that taxi is for. So what happens, what culture shock is when we come to recognition that something different is going on, right? That and often makes us feel uncomfortable, which is why we call it shock as we experience these things. And we'll talk more about culture shock when we talk about field work and some of the outcomes of the production of anthropological knowledge. Culture is also symbolic. Again, I already mentioned that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the different symbols we use, how we interpret them, and the meaning that they have. Part of the challenges that sometimes we have as anthropologists is that because we haven't grown up within that culture, and we haven't learned the various rules of navigating and negotiating with culture, because we don't know what symbols mean, we have to learn them, right? We have to be taught them formally, right? So some of these symbols might be very familiar to others, not so much. None of these symbols might be recognizable to you, depending on the various groups that you are members of. Oops, sorry. I also mentioned this, that cultures are always changing. And one of my favorite examples of this, and I think it's because people, I think especially we see this a lot on social media. People talk about things like, oh, traditional values, or this is the way it's always been. This is who we are. This is what we believe in. But when people make statements like that, what they fail to acknowledge is that cultures do change, and they can change, and they're constantly changing. And a classic example of this is fashion. We certainly don't wear the same fashion from the 1920s, although I certainly would love to. Now, 100 years later, there's some gorgeous fashion here. And so I want you to think about, so I have an example from the 1920s, and then I have another example from 2011. And now think about what fashion looks like here in the year 2022, right? So 10 years later, or how might we define, if I was to do a lineup of images of representative pandemic fashion, what would that look like? So let's talk a little bit more about this in class as well. Finally, one of the things we have to recognize, and I kind of talked about this a little bit more in terms of holism, is that when anthropologists approach humans, we recognize that humans are not only cultural organisms, but we are biocultural organisms. What does this mean? Well, it means that we recognize that our biology is influenced and shaped by our physical, natural, and our cultural environment. And we ourselves, our culture, shape our biology and the environment around us as well. And so there's this co-evolution that occurs between our biology and our cultural practices as well. So importantly, as part of this position, it means that as biocultural organisms, we have a biological makeup that allows us to create and to use culture. So we're going to talk about this when we talk about languages, about how the things that make the human brain unique that allow us to produce and use language, and why it is so different and distinct from animal communication systems, right? But part of the reason why we use language is not just because of our brain for this, but also because our brain has evolved for the symbolic thought that underpins languages themselves, right? So behavior is not simply a result of our biology, but it is also a product of our culture, right? It also means that our biological makeup allows us to interact the world, right? So we have hands, and so when we look at comparative primate anatomy, we'll talk about this, that allow us to manipulate matter. And of course, our capacity for symbolic behavior and for understanding and using symbols is a critical piece of this as well. So what does it mean to take an anthropological perspective? Well, it means that we use holism and cultural relativism in our approach to understand other cultures. Our approach is one that involves participant observation or field work in order to understand the cultures we want to study. And ethnology, or cross-cultural comparison, allows us to better understand diversity and also similarities in the human experience. At the heart of the endeavor, however, is culture, right? Is understanding culture. And so we're going to spend a lot of time looking at this term. Our next topic after this will be fieldwork. So I look forward to seeing you folks in our in-person sessions, either online or face-to-face, and I will see you all soon.